Right, to end the first half, I'm going to hand over to Tom Hounsell. Tom is the Programme Director for the suite of football programmes here at St Mary's University, which include the BSc and Foundation degree in Chelsea with Chelsea Football Club Foundation in Coaching and Development, and also the online Masters programme in Performance Football Coaching. Tom was a student here at St Mary's going back to 2012-13. Tom did his undergraduate dissertation in coaching behaviours, which I'm sure he will allude to in his presentation, and he's currently beginning his PhD journey in what is effective coaching. So hopefully he'll be able to give us a bit of an insight into what effective coaching is in the next 8 minutes. Tom Hounsell.
Okay, firstly, probably just how impressive it is just to see an alumni speak so confidently. I think it's really important that we look to see how things begin to transcend in terms of life after St Mary's University. And Michael sort of alluded to this already in terms of, I did my undergraduate dissertation in terms of coach behaviour, but this is something that has now been embedded into ultimately my professional practice. So this is a research project that I've been involved in over the last couple of seasons. And I'm really just going to talk to you about behavioural analysis and then its impact really on sports coaching as a whole. So coach behaviour analysis isn't anything new. In fact, it probably is where sports coaching research first took its first leap. Okay, so in the 70s, people decided to see what expert coaches were doing and then try to emulate that and try and replicate it to novice or less expert coaches. But that's really problematic because actually we don't really know why those coaches were behaving in the way in which they were, and that's really important. So Michael's already touched on it, and so some of the other guys, that context is key. So when we start to go into sort of the 80s, the 90s, and we start to have this more cognitive approach to coaching, i.e. why are coaches behaving the way that they are with their players, that's really important, and that's probably where some of the work is at the moment. The reason why that's really important is because there's loads of different mediating factors to why coaches might behave in lots of different ways with their players, and that might be because of practice type, it might be because of time of the year, it might be because the coach's emotions at that time, and it also changes based on who we are as individuals and who those players are in front of us. So despite having all this sort of contextual knowledge, what I was really interested in is beginning to see what were the coach profiles of the coaches at Fulham Football Club, but specifically in relation to our coaching philosophy. And the reason that we want to try to do this is just to try to ultimately increase coaches' self-awareness. So what you can see is that traditionally in coaching, we've recognised that coaches have really poor ability to recognise what it is that they do. There's a paper by Chris Cushion and colleagues who basically said 80-20 rule. So actually 80% of coaches couldn't actually accurately suggest what their coaching behaviours were in line to sort of the objective behavioural data in relation to what they said, and only 20 could match those two things. Whereas 80% of players could accurately predict those things. They could align the coach's behaviour, what the coach said they did, and ultimately what they did through the objective behaviour. What we want to try to avoid is this idea of folk pedagogy, so things that are just self-evidently true, we just accept them into our practice, this idea of Chinese whispers, where we just maybe replicate practices that look shiny, or we behave in a way in which we think coaches should behave, and that might be through some of the people around us, this sort of apprenticeship of observation that we undergo as coaching practitioners. To ultimately reduce the gap between our espoused theories versus our theories in use. So that basically just means what we say we do versus what we actually do. And if those two things can be more aligned, then maybe we might be more self-aware, and as a consequence, we might be more informed in the way in which we go about our practice with our players. But there is an issue with like disciplinary privilege, and that is often we have this idea that we restrict the idea of what counts. Ultimately, these are just numbers that are plucked out of the air. So somebody might suggest that we need to have 70% ball rolling time. We might not, depends on the day, depends on ultimately what the players have done for the last 3 days and what they might do in the next 3 days. It will also depend solely on ultimately those individuals in front of them and what the coach is trying to achieve. So that's really important. And it also means there's a lack of, there's no measurements, right? So it shouldn't necessarily mean, oh, you've said 20 questions today, and that's a really good thing. It might be, it might not be, it just depends on what we're trying to achieve with our players. So what we did is just coded 3 sessions, and we basically did this over the course of a season. So we wanted different topics, different days of the week, different times of the year, when players had played at the weekend and when they hadn't. And then we would basically review that with the coaching team, and key stakeholders had access to that footage. So it could potentially ignite some sort of critical dialogue with some of the coaching stakeholders in the environment. So here's just an example basically of what that looks like. We use the platform Coach Logic. If anyone wants to purchase it, Tom Shanks' card will be handed around at the end of the night. But what you can see is just how this has been embedded into a platform where the coach can directly see the behaviours in which they're using with their players. It's not to say anything's right or wrong, but it just might mean that coaches are more self-aware of what they did in the first place. So what we did is we basically got the coaching philosophy at Fulham, which is a nice acronym called IMPACT, and we then basically attached some coaching behaviours to this. And this was based on conversations with the coaches and key stakeholders in the environment. And then we basically just coded those. And what we began to see is, I'll just show you basically the results from the 3 sessions. But what you can see from here is they're 3 completely different sessions, 3 different days of the week, 3 different times of the year. So we've got session 1, which was defending turnovers, session 2, which was attacking turnovers, and session 3, which was controlling possession. And you can see some of the contextual factors around that, i.e. number of players, format, some of the key coaching points. But what you can see is that the coaches' behaviours were pretty similar over time. And if we start to dissect this a little bit more, you can see there's loads of positive or player-specific instruction, and we want a really individualised programme at Fulham. It's one of the things we hang our hat on. To suggest that there's player-specific instruction is probably quite a good thing to suggest that we're living out our coaching philosophy and our playing philosophy. And again, through the others, you can still see there's relatively similar trends. And that's exactly the same with things like ball rolling time. So ball rolling time here is around 60 to 70%. So if it's something that the coach has been committed to in those sessions, you can begin to see if he's actually achieved those things or not. Now, all of this is all well and good, and ultimately there is some limitations. It's really small data set. But it's not necessarily to say it's good or bad, but it might just trigger that critical reflection that the coach needs to be able to potentially trigger learning, consider his knowledge in practice, and ultimately how he engages with his individual players. It's also really important to note that sports coaching, particularly literature, is embedded in space and time. So what we typically do is we look at their behaviours exhibited in the 90-minute coaching session or the game. We don't tend to take into consideration the WhatsApp messages, the phone calls, the emails, all of the other coach behaviours that coaches engage with, not necessarily just on the 90 minutes on a Saturday, for example. And then ultimately, we just need to be able to trust that our coaches are appliers and interpreters of knowledge, and that actually they have got really good intentions at heart. I don't think any coach goes out there to have really poor or negative behaviours to their players. So it's just how we allow them to be more self-aware, how we can engage in more critical reflection to ultimately aid the coaching process and player learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Some really interesting insights into how research can inform practice within an elite performing environment. And the fact that you alluded to some of those philosophical questions around theory and practice being the same things, and being critical of our own intuition was really interesting to hear.